You're listening to the Procuretech Podcast, your weekly show for all that's cooking in the digital procurement space. Yes, we've got the hottest startups, thought leadership, and conversation from visionary industry experts, and definitely no stiff corporate content. I'm your host, James Meads, Procurement Pro, Digital Nomad, and Procuretech fanboy. And now, here's this week's show. Yes, welcome to another episode of the Procuretech Podcast, where every week we bring you insights and interviews from startup founders in the digital procurement space, as well as influencers, academics, and case studies of successful digital transformation to inspire and encourage you on your journey. Perhaps if you're struggling with convincing your CFO or difficult stakeholders with what you want to achieve. So on today's show, I've brought on the founder of a startup from Denmark who is very much into the message of encouraging deep interaction with both suppliers and with stakeholders to ensure that suppliers are delivering and are performing, and that stakeholders are involved in reporting on that. And SRM indeed has been a huge topic coming out of the pandemic in terms of who has been at the front of the queue, so to speak, when it comes to all of the supply chain disruption and making sure that companies get their goods and services on time to the right quality when there are shortages of raw materials, for example. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce you to this week's guest, who is Lars Kuch from LeanLinking. Hello, Lars.
Hello, James. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. And awesome to have you on the show. We've been following each other on LinkedIn for a while, and I always think whenever you post something, I usually unanimously agree with it. So I think we're going to have a good discussion here. I'd like to start off actually in terms of leading into this with a quote from your website, which says, "Procurement without supplier management is like sales without account management. It doesn't work." And the story that you told me when we were just chatting away before I hit record, I think is a perfect example of that. So maybe you can just regale that story again for the listeners and we can jump in from there.
Yeah, sure, James. Yeah. So what I was telling was basically, the reason why I decided to start the LeanLinking, which is a supplier management solution. And the background is basically that, after business school, I started working in an organization called Wolseley, which was a plumbing and heating distributing business at that time. And I worked as procurement analyst in my first job. And then I had many different positions in procurement, ending as head of procurement for Wolseley Central Europe. And in that role, I really had a big challenge around the supplier review meetings, because when we have these big suppliers and we have these typically quarterly review meetings with these big suppliers, we go into a meeting room, we meet with the sales director, the key account director, or other important people on the supplier side. We shake hands, we sit around the table, and then we ask each other this golden question, which is, how's our cooperation going? And I can admit today that I never had a clue on how our cooperation was really doing with a specific supplier.
And I bet you're not the only one.
I did not admit that at that time, of course. But my problem was basically that I had no feedback. I had no facts. I had no data on how the relationship with the supplier was. I had no data on supplier performance. Of course, I had data on spend. Of course, I had data on OTIF performance if I did an effort to collect those data, etc. But I was basically sitting in a large international organization with thousands of stakeholders that were working with this supplier to some degree. And I had no input on how they saw this supplier, how satisfied, dissatisfied they were with the cooperation. I had no data on where were the problems in the cooperation, where was the supplier overperforming, and these kind of facts that were really important for me if I should go into that supplier review meeting and give concrete feedback to the supplier on, where does the supplier perform well, where do they need to improve, etc.
I mean, if you had the spend to be able to take in, then I think you're probably one step ahead of a lot of organizations already by having that. I mean, it's almost depressing to say that, but I still think it's the case. So I get what you're saying, and there are kind of two parts to this, right? I mean, on the one hand, there is how do you maintain existing supplier relationships in terms of what you said, things like quarterly business reviews or monthly business reviews with your strategic suppliers. But then on the other hand, I guess it's all about gathering information from the other parts of the organization too, and understanding some of the softer aspects as well as things like, are they delivering on time? Is their quality good? So to what extent would you say supplier relationship depends on hard data versus soft data?
Well, I think it depends on both. I would say you, as a supplier manager, you would need to have access to both type of data. You would need to have availability to hard data from the core systems of the organization, like spend data in the ERPs typically or other systems. You would need to have access to the delivery performance data like OTIF from the logistics systems or ERPs. You would need to have quality information on, number of incidents from the core systems if they're registered. And if they're not registered, you need to find a way to actually build a structure around registering issues on supplier deliveries. But you would also need the more, you could call it subjective feedback from the stakeholders within the business that actually works with suppliers, because there are just elements of a cooperation with a supplier that you cannot measure in hard facts that you have in an ERP or other systems today. That is something around, ease of cooperation with suppliers. That is something about suppliers' responsiveness, etc. And then, some people would say, yes, you have SLAs, etc. Yes, you do have SLAs. But it's often on specific categories of suppliers where you can actually have SLAs. There are many categories of suppliers where it's much more, in practice at least, much more difficult to define these. And for these areas, you just need to ask your stakeholders, how do they see the cooperation with the suppliers to get that subjective feedback from them, in my opinion.
And that's a really good point, actually, because there are very different methods and ways that you would collect data for example, something like raw materials versus if you're looking at indirect spend, something like IT or spare parts, versus if you're looking at then something that is just completely service related. For example, how do you manage the performance of a marketing agency? That's almost a completely different question to how do you manage the performance of a raw materials vendor. So, I mean, in terms of what you've developed with the platform, how do you manage the different nuances between categories and direct and indirect spend in that sense?
Well, we support at LeanLinking both the management of suppliers in direct and indirect spend, but the type of data that you manage on is different on the two categories, because typically on direct spend suppliers, you would have more performance data than you would have on indirect suppliers from the core system. So example is, on direct spend suppliers, you would have OTIF measurements in some organizations, and in some organizations you would also have some kind of quality measures on suppliers, like a parts per million defect KPI, for instance. On the indirect side, you typically would not have much data to work with, basically, and that's where the more subjective feedback becomes much more relevant, I would say. What you can do on our solution is, for instance, reach out to a large stakeholder network of users of certain suppliers and then ask them to give their ratings on suppliers on different criteria of your choice, to get this feedback, not only from the key stakeholder within the business, which is maybe at a CXO level, but also to get feedback from the actual users of a supplier, because it's actually on the user level that you actually get that feedback that can actually be valuable in a quarterly review meeting with a supplier, where you can be concrete on what are the concrete problems we need to solve here to take cost out of the supply chain and maybe improve our overall cooperation with a supplier.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because often somebody like the stores person can often give very valuable feedback. You know, if they're packaging their goods in an inefficient way, or if they're constantly making partial deliveries or having to deal with returns, they're just little things that drive inefficiencies then in your business as well. So yeah, I can really see the benefit of that. And it's not always something that you can measure only on objective data. And like you say, you know, in manufacturing businesses, for raw materials, you can pull that data to a certain extent out of an ERP system, but on indirect spend, it is absolutely much more difficult to manage.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if we're talking purely about cost, first of all, what are the ways that you can use SRM and that you can use LeanLinking and the data that can provide and show dashboards for to help to drive down cost or help to mitigate cost as part of a strategic supplier relationship management strategy?
Yeah. So basically what we do on LeanLinking and what we say we do is we help organizations identify value leakage in the corporation with suppliers. And we do this in different ways. I already talked about, you know, getting feedback from the users in a structured way. That information just gives you concrete insights that can actually be used to actually take out cost in the corporation. We also have the possibility on LeanLinking to track what we call non-conformance reports, or you can think of it as a ticketing system. So whenever there is an issue on a delivery from a supplier, it can be registered on LeanLinking, shared with the suppliers, and then you track how many of these issues do you have over time. And this is basically just registering, you know, costs that are added in the supply chain that basically should be taken out, you can say. And you can't take it out before you actually start registering and you start identifying that you actually have some processes with certain suppliers that doesn't work, where there are issues. And by just registering this and highlighting these for the relevant people, for instance, the supplier managers in the organization, you know, you have concrete advice right there to take actions to actually take cost out of the supply chain. And often when we talk direct spend, for instance, this is often happening in the goods received area, you know, where people receive trucks from suppliers, and they identify issues in the deliveries. And then, you know, if they can register these cases in an easy way, and then procurement can have easy access to this information, you have value right there, because then procurement can take those information, that insight, into a supplier quarterly review meeting, and you can avoid that these things keeps repeating over time, these issues in the supply chain.
So maybe you can walk me through then some of the advantages of using a tool like LeanLinking, or indeed, you know, other best of breed solutions for SRM versus, you know, the limitations perhaps of ERP systems. I think we touched on it a bit already in terms of, you know, it's difficult to do it for indirect commodities in ERP systems, but there are also a lot of digital procurement suites, you know, these enterprise level solutions that claim to do everything. So where do you see the limitations of both ERP systems and these, you know, digital procurement all-encompassing suites that have been on the market now for a number of years?
Well, I think ERPs are simply not built for supplier management. They are not built for sharing information with suppliers and being, transparent with suppliers. They are built to manage everything that happens within the company. And that's one advantage we have with LeanLinking. You know, we are built to actually make collaboration and a transparent cooperation with the suppliers seamless. So you can share data, you can share issues, you can share ratings with suppliers over the platform and truly engage suppliers in a collaborative and transparent way. And regarding the Ariba's, the Coupas, etc., it's not a focus area for these companies. At least to my knowledge, they don't have actual solutions in SRM. Maybe they have something they brand, but they don't have solutions where you basically enable not just to capture data from your from your core systems like the ERPs or other solutions, but also to capture information from your stakeholders within the business, so that you get this 360 picture on not only what does your hard data say, but what does your stakeholders actually say around your suppliers and how they perform. And they don't enable this scorecarding and sharing of scorecarding on suppliers with the suppliers over the platform. So you can actually work with shared agendas on the same platform around improving the collaboration together.
And I think the difference between ERP systems and these sort of enterprise level digital procurement suites, or certainly if I look at SAP, they've done a lot recently to sort of integrate with some of these best of breed solutions, and they now have an app store, don't they? And they're collaborating actively with startups that are offering these best of breed solutions to enable them to plug into the data that SAP as an ERP system has. And I think that actually is quite a smart move if they're recognizing that it's not their core business, but that businesses need to have this functionality and a way to be able to connect the data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And we also, with many customers, we are an add-on to Ariba, for instance, also. So we have many customers that has Ariba already, and then they put us on top, you can say, to that suite.
So let's explore a little bit in terms of a business that may not be so cost focused in terms of how they manage their suppliers. I mean, I'm thinking the obvious example of a tech business, like someone like a Google or a Facebook that's, probably not got their eyes so much on cost and are more into things like innovation and growth, especially if it's like a smaller, rapidly growing tech startup that wants to scale rather than look at cost management as their primary objective. What sort of objectives then would they have as part of their SRM strategy, and how could LeanLinking help them to achieve that?
Yeah, so in those kind of companies like Google, tech companies, but also in companies like pharma, for instance, where actually the cost on suppliers is quite small compared to the turnover. In those kind of companies, the focus is not so much on cost savings, I would say, in procurement. It's more on value creation and innovation. And the focus is often here, how can you work better together with suppliers to actually create new innovation or more value for your end customers. That is what we see out there. And it's really interesting. I saw at a conference a few years ago a few VPs of procurement from Google who said that they, in their central procurement team, the term cost savings were not allowed to say, basically, which was quite interesting, given the fact that it was a procurement function. But the logic here is basically that, as they said, when they select suppliers, they are looking for suppliers that can actually help them develop a new product that can take them to the next level. The example they gave at that time was basically and I think they closed that project, but at that time they were looking to provide internet via air balloons across the world. And they were seeking a supplier who could produce these air balloons so they could stay up there in the air for many, many years. And then they basically said they didn't care whether such an air balloon costed $50,000 or $100,000. If it could just stay up there and deliver the quality they needed, then they basically didn't care about the cost of the product, because the value in what they could bring would be so much bigger, basically. So in those kind of companies, that there is a different way of looking at suppliers, and it's much more driven together with their own product development, you can say, and their own innovation that they need to bring to the market.
Absolutely. And the amount of revenue and profit that those companies can generate just through having the right innovation partner can just make any cost savings pale into insignificance. I guess it's a different world, isn't it, to the more traditional manufacturing company that's always got their eyes on cost. So I guess my final question then that I would ask you is, if a procurement manager or a head of procurement was to start an SRM strategy pretty much from scratch and was given the opportunity to use your software, what would be perhaps the 3 tips that you could give them to get the most out of it in terms of how they engage their suppliers and stakeholders and build a strategy around that, regardless of whether they're more focused on cost or innovation?
The first thing I would say is, you should be very clear about what is the objective of your SRM program and have that clearly defined in the organization, and have top management commitment and support to this. That is what we see always is critical, basically. So that is number one. Number two, I would say is, do a supplier segmentation where you clearly define different segments of suppliers that you want to manage differently. What we see often is organizations, they do a supplier segmentation and put suppliers into groups like strategic, tactical, operational, or something like that. And then they just work with the suppliers in the same way across the different segments. That's not the point of the segmentation. The point of segmentation is to clearly work very differently with different types of suppliers in very different ways. So that's the second recommendation, to do a segmentation and make clear decisions on how are you actually going to manage these different suppliers differently. And then the third is regarding organization. What I suggest is that you take a new look at your organization. And maybe if you have a very clear-cut category split of your organization, then maybe not change that, but add to it 2 new organizations or teams, you could say. A team for supplier onboarding and sourcing, and a team for supplier management. Because for me, when you need to manage suppliers, it is a completely different process than actually finding new suppliers, running an RFQ process, doing negotiations. Working with suppliers and actually creating more value with suppliers, that requires a special skill set around joint business development, understanding business and how you, as 2 organizations, can work together, identify cost in supply chain and take them out, and how you can co-develop to actually create more value together. And that is a very difficult task, I think, and it requires a very special skill set to actually be extremely successful in that position.
There are 3 great tips, actually, Lars. Thank you for that. That's I think that's a real golden nugget for anyone that's listening to this and is maybe starting an SRM strategy from scratch, or is in an organization that maybe paid it lip service in the past, but never really developed it, as you say, beyond the strategic, tactical, and I can't remember the other one that you said in terms of supplier segmentation. So thank you for those tips. Final question, Lars, if anyone would like to connect with you or perhaps arrange a demo or learn a little bit more about what LeanLinking can do and what it can measure and the look and feel of the system, what's the best way that they can get in touch with you?
Just go to LeanLinking.com, and then it's quite clear what you need to do to request a demo.
Fantastic. So what are your plans for the future, actually? Have you got anything exciting in development?
Yes, we do, now that you are asking. So we are actually in the early stages of developing a fact-based negotiation solution where we enable procurement and supplier negotiators to actually utilize all the data you have on suppliers in our current solution to actually bring insights into the negotiation solution and give concrete advice on how you should actually approach the negotiation. And then we build a process around it to make the negotiation process much more seamless than it is in most organizations today. So that's something we expect to release here late this year. Basically, we just started development of it, so it's very exciting.
And that seems like the obvious, logical next step with all of the data that you're collecting, right? So I think, that's a really smart add-on. And I think it's also something that that fits or marries really nicely to what you do as your core solution. So yeah, good luck with that. When you launch it, maybe we can do a follow-up interview or get you back on. So yeah, Lars, thank you so much for joining me today. Great to learn about what you're doing and some of the problems that in your own career had inspired you to create your own startup. It's always nice to hear fellow procurement pros developing something to fix a problem that's well known within our industry. So yeah, all the best for the future, and keep in touch.
Definitely. Thanks for having me, James.
Pleasure. Take care.
You too. Thanks.
So I hope that interview gave you a little bit of inspiration around how you can either start or maximize or build on your SRM strategy within your organization. And obviously, because this is a show all about procurement tech, as a cool software platform there with LeanLinking of how you can do it and extrapolate some great data that is not just hard data, but also some soft data from your stakeholders too. Thank you very much for listening to the show. I realize now there are a lot of procurement podcasts out there, so I'm very grateful that you've chosen to listen to us today, and thank you for inserting us into your earballs. Don't forget to subscribe to the show where you listen to your podcasts if you want to get notifications of new episodes every week when we publish. And if you'd like to be a guest on the show, maybe you've got a cool story to tell to our listeners, then just drop me a line or connect with me on LinkedIn, and I would love to hear from you. Until next time, take care wherever you are, and bye for now.